I told you this is rock influences before. I hope we're going to start off with some things that when you emerge on the folk scene, what were what were the early days like?
Well, see, you're going to try and squeeze the folk into rock, or are you talking about folk influences on rock, kind of?
Let's start off with the folk influences in the early folk scene.
Okay. Because my scene was it was ballads. I mean, I came out of junior high school, I learned how to play the ukulele. In high school, I picked up the guitar, and I sang rhythm and blues. And then I discovered Odetta, Harry Belafonte, and then began with the more obscure, and Pete Seeger, and then began with the more obscure people, which was the thing to do at age 18 in Harvard Square. And then learned most of just ballads, American ballads, English, Irish, Scottish ballads, in Harvard Square, direct from people in the coffee shops.
There was a certain repertoire of songs that were sung back then in these ballads. What do you consider maybe your favorites or some of the best of that time?
Well, there were ones that I fell in love with then that have seemed to have lasted forever. A song that's requested constantly still after 25 years is Silver Dagger. It sort of has everything. Everybody's miserable. The mother has a knife with her in the bed, and girl's not supposed to marry anybody. And I think you had to have one or both of the hero and heroine die at the end of the song in order for it to qualify. And in some versions of the song, it ends up saying, "Let's all pick up our silver daggers and plunge them into our lily white breasts." So everybody gets to die in that one. Mary Hamilton, John Riley, some of the long-lasting ballads. But I really don't even do ballads anymore at all.
Would you say that those early songs concerned a lot of injustice to the working class?
Well, you know, during that time period, I was already very political myself, and that had begun before I could really verbalize it very well. And then I went on a peace march when I was 14 years old by my own choice, and was very politicized. And then when I started singing in Cambridge and started learning ballads, the politics and social awareness sort of went underground. I mean, I really was just wrapped up in these beautiful ballads and in being in love, and it all went together. And I really was obsessed with that for a couple of years. And so I'm not sure where all those songs came from. They were so personalized. I mean, there weren't many Joe Hill songs back then. They were really about the trials and tribulations of life in a big family, or of love forsaken, and that seemed to be, you know, that fantasy that I loved living in then. And I didn't really connect it too much with you know, social needs and so forth.
As those began to emerge, though, as you got into that new genre, if we can call it that, do you think that those songs, when you started singing them, evoked a change in the community, or maybe a new awareness?
Which songs? The new songs?
The newer songs.
Well, obviously, yes. They were a reflection of the times, and then they also supported the social awareness and political action eventually. Probably the songs started to fuse for me because I went into the South very early and started singing. I went down and was very annoyed because the audiences were segregated, so I put in the contract they have to be integrated. Of course, no blacks knew who I was, so we'd have to go into the NAACP and rent a couple of them to bring them over the hall to integrate the audience. But then I went down in 1963, I think, and sang in black schools. And there, the songs that brought together the music and the politics were "We Shall Overcome," and that's when things had started to heat up in the South anyway. "We Shall Overcome" and "Oh Freedom" and freedom marching songs. And then the next step was, that brings us to about 1964 anyway. And then the songs began to be written. Probably the best known one back then was "There But for Fortune," that was really directly trying to say something about the times. And then for me, probably obviously the strongest work then, and the strongest work that remains from that time period, was Dylan first, and then some of the things that the Beatles wrote, or are anthems now internationally.
As long as you mentioned Dylan, I had a couple questions I mentioned to you.
Isn't that sweet of me to do that, so you wouldn't have to just cram it down my throat? Go ahead.
In the early 60s, you and Bob Dylan were fairly close. Can you tell some of the first impressions of his music, and also how he had an effect on your music at that time?
His music overwhelmed me because it was, for me, everything that I needed. You know, I didn't write songs, and I thought I'd been called an interpretess of song. I thought that's what I was, so it never occurred to me to write. And so I guess I was looking around for music that would say what it was I had on my mind. And Bobby's stuff just said it. I mean, the times are changing. I sang that as some huge big do for President Johnson just after Kennedy was killed, and it was talking directly to the senators and the congressmen and scolding them, and, you know, I mean, how he wrote that stuff just poured out of him was just amazing. And so it influenced my music tremendously, and my career, and all of that.
Do you think that there are certain parallels, or can you draw any parallels between your music of that time and any of the ballads that are emerging, or any of the songs that are emerging, the contemporary stuff, Springsteen singing, Cougar, some of those?
Well, I would say that then there was a real rejection of policies of the United States of America. Here there is an acceptance of them, and within that acceptance you gripe. And you make your songs and you can gripe, but it really is, for instance, Farm Aid was fascinating because it was cloaked like the Springsteen album cover in red, white, and blue jeans and God Bless America. And within that context, people were complaining. I have difficulty with that because I don't accept any nation state. I mean, I have the same difficulty with USSR, with China, with Vietnam, and I'm always, when I am in trouble, it's for criticizing the government and that nation state as a unit. And people right now are riding this funny fence between what Reagan tells them to believe, which is gung-ho, everything's terrific, red, white, and blue, and then realizing that they've got, you know, we have some serious problems. I think the most outspoken album at the moment is Jackson Browne. I mean, I hear the tape in his head. Somebody said, well, Jackson, they're not going to listen to this. You better do that. And he finally must have said, to hell with it. I have to say these things. And he put them to an updated beat. And he's having some success with it. I'm very pleased with that he had the nerve to do it. I mean, that's talking about a risk.
So you would agree that maybe the biggest change is protesting from without rather than singing songs that are within the system?
I think the biggest difference is called risk. At the, you know, in the 60s, people took certain risks. You had to at a certain point. I mean, even Peter, Paul, and Mary. I remember the first time I called them and I said, do you want to come? I'm going on this march. And they said, yeah, I'll be there, you know, where's the train? And then they thought it was for civil rights. But but in the last few months, whatever had happened, it was a march demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. And Peter said, oh, and wait a minute, you know, that's a different cup of tea, because that was a little riskier. And it was risky. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Your career at some point is going to be in jeopardy from things you do. At the moment, certainly not Live Aid. Live Aid, your career's in jeopardy if you don't show up, you know. So in some sense, those are some of the differences, but I'm not downing those things at all. I consider Live Aid and Farm Aid and Sports Aid and all of it to be what I call a reaching out of the silence and ashes of the 70s. And that silence and ashes is moral, spiritual, musical, everything. There's just a very quiet period where it looked as though we could go on this silent railroad forever. Either that or noise just to obliterate the silence, but nothing, be very careful not to say anything. And now it seems as though people are reaching around for something that has some meaning.
You mentioned that your career maybe could be in jeopardy if you didn't show up for the event. Do you think that as the music business becomes more business-oriented and maybe not quite so in tune with the aesthetics of music, do you think that people are still as concerned today? You know, you touched on it right there, but back in your day you were doing certain songs because you believed in it. Now as the music industry is coming around, do you understand where I'm leading that?
No, continue.
Okay.
Because
if the business, I mean, if the music business is turning around to be more of a business these days, do you think they are as still concerned as you were in your day?
Well, first of all, let us be righteously cynical about the music industry and the people who make money in it. Basically, their job is making money. So when somebody said to me, well, gee, Joan, do you think you haven't had an album in the last 6 years because of your politics? They don't really care about politics. I mean, and they don't care about sexuality, as long as you're going to make a lot of money for them. And so then I begin to wonder whether, you know, my problems have come out of the fact that I simply refuse to donate myself to that cause of simply making money, because that really does decide how you're going to write the song, what the beat is going to be, what the words are going to be, and within that context you can say a few things. My difficulty is I've always had to say those things, period, and now I have to find a way that's palatable for mainstream people to listen to. I think that won't be any problem for me. I think because I'm very, very musical and I'm interested in all this as an experiment. And I also think people are hungry for different kinds of music, that they get tired of hearing the same thing over and over again. But I've taken you away from your question. And I can't.
Well, no, I don't think so. I would say, obviously you're musical, you just said it, and you've been doing it for 27 years now. Do you think that the music has power to change things, or to at least influence people, or do you have to do other things besides that?
Number two of the above. I think I would not like to be involved with social change when there wasn't music around. For instance, some of the marches, all these things that are re-emerging now in the 80s are very curious. People have run out of songs for social change because they haven't been written, because we have not been in struggle to create those songs. So on a march, people end up chanting. And I hate that. What do you want now? What do you want? Peace. What do you want it now? And people, I mean, it just sounds sort of frightening. And I think it's simply for lack of the music. Well, the music just makes it difficult for the police to arrest you, makes it a lot harder for them to knock you over the head with a stick. I mean, music is a very magical business. But as you suggested, it can't be just the music. And that may be one of the fallacies now with we are the world, we are the children. You're very rich ones, you know. I mean, very privileged young children, very privileged stars, very privileged rock and rollers. Granted, I think, wanting to share, but they have to see out of that. You know, all of that is wrapped up in the business and the money making in the 80s and the cocoon that we live in when we're safe and wealthy. And you see over that to Ethiopian children and do something for them, but it hasn't really moved within us. It hasn't really moved people yet to be ready for the risk or whatever.
So do you think that this sphere of influence, or do you think it's been strengthened or weakened over the past 20 years, since the early 60s?
Well, I think it's gone through massive changes. I mean, I think there was a time when it all came in and worked together. I mean, that's exactly as it did for me. I mean, all of my social and political leanings were supported by the music around me that was being written. And at a time like now, the music will always reflect what's going on in the society. And I think it's curious that it's been through the Bee Gees, who made a point of not saying anything that would ruffle anybody's feathers ever. And that's how I would typify music of the 70s, a lot of the later 70s. Just don't bug us. You know, everything's going to be okay, and we want to feel good about ourselves. And a lot of music is still that. Then there's a reaction against that by heavy groups, you know, and they have very harsh words. I don't know what they do with their lives. I find U2 a fascinating group because they are apparently, I mean, if they called up Amnesty International and said, we want to do something for you, I've never heard of that in my lifetime. You know, that a group that's very, very popular, and you usually write them hundreds of letters saying, would you do something in this benefit and that benefit, and they only sign on if it's really going to be a hot deal. But they called up and initiated it. And that seems to me one more step in the Live Aid process of sharing. And people like that, I think, have to be cultivated and spoken to and worked with, because they're the ones who are going to put the music and the thinking and eventually possibly the action together. It will happen, you know, it will happen. I think we're far from it at the moment, except for the exceptions like Jackson and like the people who have always done it. I've always done it, so I'm no big deal. You know, I just have always done it.
Well, speaking of you were kind of at the vanguard of between whenever you went from folk into rock, and now you've even gone even further into rock, if you want to call it that. How do you view this process?
Do you mean by today, or do you mean the thoughts of what I'm...
You initially were in there whenever it started to make the transition into rock, and now it seems like it's even gone. I mean, it's been a long time since I thought I'd hear Joan Baez saying Pink Floyd up there. But I just want you to comment a little bit on that evolution, both at the beginning and now, how you feel.
Well, I think for me there's a lot of personal stuff. At the very beginning, I mean, aside from all the politics, I had a Spanish father whose father was an ex-Catholic and a Methodist minister. I had a terrific puritanical streak. And on my very first album, which I made in 1959, I didn't want to put another guitar player on it because I thought that would make it commercial, and I would literally go to hell when I died for doing that. Well, they finally convinced me that it would make it more musical and not necessarily more commercial. And so I did that. So, you know, if you want to look at it that way, my life's been a series of sellouts since the first album, you know, and depending on how hard I'm going to be on myself. And then that personal, puritanical stuff just took me years of combating it before I could enjoy myself, make jokes on the stage. And in some senses, I'm an entirely different person from that original, very frightened, very shy, somewhat hostile and strident girl. And so I'm different now. I think I know when I'm singing something, whether it's a put on and not really made for me, or whether it is. I mean, and there are also places for it. If I tried to sing in a very quiet Japanese concert hall, tried to sing a song where I moved around the way I did today, it wouldn't fit. I would feel silly. I'd probably feel silly doing the blues I did today. The blues today was absolutely comfortable for me. And I wish that we'd had time to have more musicians, and I've done that on the road when I run into musicians, and that's not a problem. So, you know, you can say she does the blues, I wouldn't have when I was younger, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think the limit has anything to do with changing times and changing music, just what I find that I can do well. That's all.
Well, maybe we should have did this question a little bit before, but it seems that in a lot of music there's some kind of thread, and you haven't mentioned him before, but Woody Guthrie and some of his influence. Were you influenced?
Well, I was influenced by Woody Guthrie through Pete Seeger, because I never met Woody, and his health was deteriorating by the time I knew anything about him, and through Bobby, because Bobby was tremendously influenced by, go ahead, by him at the beginning. But for me it was mostly the Guthrie songs I knew through Pete Seeger. Pete was a very strong influence on my life. In fact, I don't know whether you have this in your records or not, but at the very beginning I wouldn't go on ABC's Hootenanny show because they had blacklisted Pete Seeger, and he was my hero. We have political differences, and we had then, but the point was that Pete sang, and he did, and he behaved, and he spent his money in a certain way that all came together and made some sense, and was really seemed to have something to do with the suffering of the world, and he did seem to care. So he was a very strong influence on me. And by the way, they did eventually let him on, and then I went on television for the first time, for a big network show was the first time.
I think you might have done it before, but just a list of some of your favorite people during that time, during the 60s.
Well, a lot of them were personal friends I'd met in Harvard Square, and nobody would ever know of them, but I spent so much time just being there and around them and learning songs from them. Seeger was the primary influence. I listened to Odetta for years. I listened to some blues long enough to realize that I couldn't sing it then. I had a very high soprano and it didn't make any sense, you know, Lead Belly and all those people. And then I still loved Harry Belafonte, but I had to put him in the back of the closet on the racks because I didn't want anybody to think that I like commercial music.
The impact that you think that you and Seeger and Odetta and other people in the folk business have brought to the rock field.
Well, see, I can only tell that by meeting people. I mean, running into Judas Priest at Live Aid, and they always have the same reaction. They want to shake my hand and say, "I respect you very much. My mother has all your albums," or whatever. And I always give him a big hug, and he says, "Did you know that we'd recorded one of your songs, and how much you meant to me and how much you meant to us?" So I don't know that the music itself, I mean, they didn't do ballads, but something in the combination, in the package that I was and came with in the 60s influenced all of those people to one degree or another, at least so they tell me as I travel around the world, you know, in Germany, France, Spain, Latin America, Africa, that the Dylan music, the Beatles, the Stones, and I interpreted that. I was in that package somewhere as an interpreter, not so much as a writer.
Why do you think, and you mentioned it, the Bee Gees sang about nothing, and that was typical of the 70s. Why do you think there was that kind of a fading from the folk?
Well, I think folk is introspective, quiet, thoughtful, and I don't think people wanted to be, nor do they yet want to be again. I don't know if we'll be around long enough to have another cycle, but when I was 18 years old, you looked for a coffee shop and you went in and you hung out and you talked to people. And you listened to music that made you think about yourself, and then a couple years later made you think about issues. And now it's really the opposite. You go into somewhere to obliterate yourself with sound so you don't have to think about anything. That really is mostly what I see going on up and down streets. You know, there's some counterculture clubs which have hung in there, and they'll be there forever, but they're certainly not mainstream at all. And I think the times are such that, I mean, some polls taken in high schools, and the 50% of the kids think they're going to die in a nuclear war. You know, why go think about it? Why not go surfing or dancing or listen to something really loud and wipe it all out? I think that's part of it.
Well, we've gone through your life in 23 minutes now, and
Pretty good.
I wonder just who are some of the artists you listen to now? You mentioned Jackson Browne, but and maybe just elaborate on that, and maybe a few other people.
Well, I have a favorite album of last year, and that's Dire Straits. I mean, I just thought it was just musically and the timing and everything was just brilliant. I love U2. I'm not even sure why their stuff isn't compatible with me, with my voice and so forth, but just to listen to them. My favorite album, as I look back, I mean, there are a few favorites, and one of them is that Final Cut, Pink Floyd's Final Cut, that I'll take it with me when I travel, and maybe I sleep better to bombing and strafing than anything else, but I just think it's beautiful. I like Genesis a lot. I like Phil Collins with or without Genesis. I guess usually if there's a voice in there that I take to especially, I mean, you're talking about current day music more or less, yeah? A voice. I'm not interested in protest songs. I'm interested in some kind of substance. We were talking about the song Shout. That I like it, I like the rhythm, I like to dance to that, but I also like words that are I would call counterculture. You're not really sure what they mean, and they sort of dig away at you a little bit. And there's a lot of that around. I can't cope with punk music. My son has tried. Believe me, he's tried. He's strewn the floor with records and put on one after another and said, "But listen to these words, Mom. These are really great." And I've told him I'll read the words, but I can't. Whatever that step is from new wave into punk, I can't. I don't seem capable of making it. That's the only one I'd say I really have trouble with. The rest I want to hear. You know.
So what's the next direction?
Well, actually, this summer I'm doing two things, and I think they give you an idea of how haphazard my career is at the moment. I've been invited to do the first non-classical concert in the Genoa Opera House in Italy, which will take a certain kind of preparation. And I've been invited on the U2 Sting Amnesty International benefit tour. That's 6 concerts of me trying to figure out whether I just say grace again the way I did at Live Aid and beat it, or whether I can get a few musicians together and try to make 2 or 3 songs palatable for a rock and roll audience. And I would choose the second because I like challenges.
Best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.